Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Brent Turvey. I'm here with Melanie Inglis, forensic investigator out of Canada. And this week on The Hard Truth, we're going to talk about serial crime. Part one, we're going to focus on rape and sexual assault. Good afternoon, Melanie. How you doing? How's the future? You're an hour ahead. How's the future?
Fantastic. Everything is different.
Like a whole hour different, right?
Yes, everything.
Oh, I'm really glad to hear that. So, this week, we're going to talk about two different cases that came out in the two different verdicts that were rendered that have a great deal of impact on how I think people both can perceive and understand and appreciate the problems with the criminal justice system and the disparity between different kinds of crimes, or serial crimes, and different kinds of defendants and different kinds of victims. So I want to start by talking about serial rape as a concept. What is serial rape? Serial rape, when we use that word, we're talking about two or more sexual assaults or rapes that occur committed by the same offender or group of offenders that involves a cooling off period, an in-between period. So serial means two or more, and that's because we are using that term to allocate resources and to identify potential patterns to help stop future victims. That's the first part of it. And then also there's this notion of the cooling off period, which requires that the offender reintegrate with their regular life. And as I talk about this concept more and more, I feel like it needs better exploration, because it's not as though they go into a fugue state and become some other person and do this and then go back. It's more like their regular life is not interrupted by what it is that they're doing. Instead of the difference between them and sort of somebody who's on a spree is that they stop their regular living and they just go into a crime committing mode that doesn't end until either they are apprehended or they are killed, very often. But there are a tremendous amount of serial rapes that are undiscussed and even unrecognized in the United States. Do you get the same sense in Canada as well, as there's an active move to identify serial rapes, or what we call pattern rapes, and investigate them? Or is it just not something that's talked about very often in the media?
It's not talked about very often in the media, and it's definitely not something that I've seen that they're trying to investigate and come to a conclusion or stop these people from doing it. It's sort of swept under the rug as far as I'm concerned. I
think that's a very fair comment. And let me just tell our listeners why. The reason why it's swept under the rug is because there are so many of them. If you have most investigators, most competent professional law enforcement know that if you identify one rapist, you're potentially sitting on an offender who's committed it many times. And this is going to require a real investigation. Plus, you have a living victim. Plus, the way that sex crimes are investigated does not permit the law enforcement investigators to interview the victim more than a couple times. The prosecutors are going to stop that right away because they don't want inconsistencies in the statement. So there is a constant pushback within the law enforcement community to actually investigate and explore the true dimensions of sexual assault. Not only who's committing those crimes, but who the victim targets are. One of the things that Aurelio and I developed over the last couple of years is the concept of constrained context theory, which says that essentially people act in accordance with the constraints that are put upon them. They are with terms of culture, public policy, relationships, their self-identity, their physical abilities, their hopes, their dreams, their desires, and the physical space that they occupy. All of it provides context. And as you constrain that context, it limits their options and choices. In this context, all of the vulnerable populations of victims are usually pushed into one area: low economic depressed. Serial rapists like to target the homeless, the runaways, the prostitutes, drug addicts, people that if they complain, they won't be believed. And when those populations are exhausted or don't exist fully, they can choose an area where law enforcement is not taking the crime of sexual assault or rape seriously. And that is, unfortunately, the vast majority of areas. And you can sit down with a police officer and they'll try to keep a straight face for about 3 minutes as they try to pretend with you that their agency is doing something proactive or even responding adequately or competently to a rape investigation. But then after about 3 minutes, if you just ask the right questions, they will break down in frustration with you and join your solidarity of your suffering, because they know those cases are not being assigned detectives, they're not being investigated properly, or they're not being investigated at all. If they're not solved by patrol, prostitutes, homeless, runaways, drug addicts, these cases just get shoved to the side. Is that the same in Canada, or am I describing a completely new reality to you?
Absolutely not. I think it's the same in Canada. And I also think, just to touch on that, in the other demographic, when you're talking about people who are outside of the vulnerable demographic that you just stated, when we're talking about women as a different vulnerable demographic in healthy relationships as well, I find that as soon as the complaint has been made, when it goes to law enforcement, there's not an understanding of how and when and what rape can look like in any of these situations. So even as a woman in a vulnerable demographic, in, say, a committed relationship, I've heard cops say, well, it can't be rape, it's your husband, or it can't be rape, it's your boyfriend. Everybody has to understand what we're talking about in order for any of this to make any sense going forward when it comes to investigations, right?
It's about the withdrawal of consent. Even if you're in a committed relationship, you can withdraw your consent for sexual activity at any moment. That is your right.
That's
you
right.
have that right.
And women,
right.
I was just going to say, and women are part of a vulnerable demographic as well. So it's not just those that are in the demographics that you described. And I find a lot with prostitution, that's another thing, or even dancers, for that matter, exotic dancers. They get accused of, kind of asking for it without even being talked to as someone who just suffered something probably very traumatic. Indeed, it was very traumatic, but you don't want to ask them those questions because, well, it's their lifestyle. So you know what, you should expect that something like that would happen. So people are not going to come forward anymore.
If your law enforcement community in your area does not respond respectfully, responsibly, and professionally to these kinds of complaints and investigate them fully every time, they're going to lose the trust of the community. They're going to lose the trust of the victims in their cases, and that's going to turn into a lack of trust from the community in general. But I want to just touch on what you said, which is that women are a vulnerable population. This is a really big problem, and I can hear the men going, well, wait a minute, men this and men suffer that, and I'm like, stop, brother, just stop. You shut your mouth and then learn something. The reason why men are bad at this is because they don't want to talk about it, because they know that they actually benefit from any environment which reduces the ability of a woman to say no, to withdraw consent. That's why we like noisy nightclubs. That's why we like places where there's lots of alcohol, because it drops the guard of the female and makes it so that our, sort of pathetic, incapable attempts can create a context where the woman might not be able to say no. The only people who like that are rapists. Most men do not like that. They do not want this context. They want a context where they can talk to the female, or they can talk to the target of their affection, and they can negotiate something consensual in fun and in good faith, instead of it being this situation where they create a context where the person literally cannot escape, does not have all their cognitive function, and feels threatened by even the notion of saying no, doesn't feel comfortable saying no. And so we have to start from that premise right there, that most men don't know how to negotiate the concept of consent. And because that's true, and men commit the vast majority of the rapes, we tend to put all of the responsibility for negotiating consensual sexual relationships on women. And that is the cornerstone of what's called rape culture, because it makes the woman responsible and says, hey, the man's going to do stuff. The man's going to do what they're going to do. That's how men are. That's how men are. No, they're not. That's how rapists are. That's not how men are. Men are not like that. Rapists are like that.
The good old saying, boys will be boys.
Rapists will be rapists, and and actual men don't rape. That's how it works, because that's the problem. We're putting it on to women to negotiate that. So the first questions, the first evidence that rape culture is sort of taking over is when a detective, male or female, starts asking questions about what the victim is wearing. You know what I mean? Tell me your experience with that.
Oh, I've got a personal experience with filing a claim against a person in the law enforcement umbrella. And the questions that were asked immediately during this investigation were, well, what were you wearing? How long did you know this person? Did
And
you
where were
flirt
you?
with him? What were you drinking? Did you at all look at him in any way that may invite him into your space?
And what time was it? Was it past your?
What time was it?
Where
Was
were
it
you at?
especially?
Were you somewhere you weren't supposed to be? Where was your
Exactly.
man at? Where was your owner at? I mean, sorry, your man.
Exactly. Yeah, your owner. Those were all questions that were asked, not one about the person that the complaint was about. It was all about, well, how can we prove that she asked for it?
Yeah. Well, they're
That's what they were doing.
instead of taking on the role of listening, they take on the role of defense attorney because they don't know how to. What they aren't going to admit is that they don't know how to do a real investigation. That's the first thing they're not going to admit. So what they're doing is they're putting all the burden on the person making the statement, saying, okay, you've made this statement. I find it uncredible. I find the circumstances uncredible. I'm not going to pursue it because I know that a defense attorney could tear it apart. And I'm not competent enough as an investigator to put together a case with the physical evidence and through a competent investigation to protect you from that. That's what they're saying. And that is a common refrain. And once you couch it like that and shame law enforcement into recognizing that they're admitting that they don't have the abilities that they're pretending to have, then you might get some traction. Then you might actually get some movement, maybe.
It also goes back to a few of the subjects we've talked about previously, which is going against their own. So I'm making a complaint against somebody who is in law enforcement, and then they are going to have to go against their own, which is something that we know is not not allowed.
And we'll talk about that in this podcast, because at the end we're going to talk about two cases at the end. So the first thing that's supposed to happen, let's walk through a complaint so that people understand what that's about. Someone's been sexually assaulted. Now they have a decision. First of all, they got to know that they were sexually assaulted. If they were in a condition or a state where they are not having their full faculties, not proper memory, they might not remember what have happened. They may only have indications. All right. So whether they have indications or whether they experience the full event and recall it, they have to make a decision to report. And the vast majority of the time, the research says women don't report. And the reason why is shame, stigma, the harm the reaction of society, the reaction of their loved ones, and the disruption that it will cause to their life and their identity. So a lot of women will just say, fuck it, I'm not going through this because I don't trust law enforcement or the justice system enough, or even my own family enough to protect me as I go through this gauntlet of hell. That's right. What are some of the things I missed there in making that decision to report?
The stigma altogether, dependent, like in my situation, it was law enforcement. So there was fear, there was threats, there was all these things from law enforcement to pull out from having this complaint go through. But in general, I just find that women they're shamed and they're not believed. So what's the point? It's just a waste of time. That's how you feel when you're making that decision, whether to file the complaint or not. And as we've seen, and as I've seen, nothing happens most of the time. So you file a complaint, you go through this long process, and there's all of these emotions and feelings that come up, and nothing happens to the person. Usually the victim suffers. The person who suffered through the trauma has a whole bunch of emotional things and traumatic experience now that they have to work through, while the other person usually just gets told, well, you might not want to do that again if you did it. It's slap on the wrist.
If it's that, and the notion is that you have this thing that's happened, and I think people hearing this will have a hard time believing that you made a complaint to law enforcement about law enforcement and nothing happened. I will just say this right now. That is the most common response. The most common response is to find a reason not to do an investigation if a complaint is made to the agency. The other thing is, when a complaint is made to an agency, they are not allowed to investigate it themselves. They are required to bring in an outside agency to investigate the crime. We just finished a case in Illinois where the agency hid the officer's series of rapes. There's a Phil Flores. He was accused by, I think, 2 or 3 women of sexual assault before he was involved in the shooting death of his girlfriend that had broken up with him because of his domestic violence, because of his abuse and his violent nature. But the cops rallied around this guy because his MO was very strikingly similar to the MO of many police officers. He would go to the bar, wait for some attractive female to get drunk, and then he'd throw his badge up and say, don't worry, I'll give her a ride home. And she'd wake up in the morning having had sex with him, like going, what in the world just happened? he's like, oh, we had a great time. And she's like, I didn't want you. Who are you? You know,
Exactly.
so
Yeah.
that kind of targeting is very common because law enforcement knows exactly who to target and how and where. And that's a very big, that's not a small thing. And the failure to respond, just doing an internal sort of cover up without bringing in external agencies or making the report correct, that kind of thing, which is pathological and part of the identity of law enforcement, is what makes people not trust them. And I don't think there's any other way to say it. And too often police officers are like, well, I don't care. It's us against them. And they're all shitheads anyway. They're all bad anyway. There's only us and them. There's only criminals and cops and whatever. And we got to protect ourselves. No, you get a complaint. You're obligated to investigate instead of finding reasons not to. So
and that was interesting. I didn't know that piece of information, that they are supposed to bring in an outside source to do the investigation, because in my own investigation,
they can't do a criminal investigation themselves. They can do an internal investigation, an administrative investigation themselves for policies and procedures, but the criminal investigation can never be conducted by the agency's own officers to maintain independence and impartiality. They're usually required by written protocol to contact an external agency. So my advice to women anywhere who have been sexually assaulted by the police or a police agency, you don't go to that guy's agency and report it. That's going nowhere, ever. All the cops are going to lie and protect, and you're giving them license to harass and threaten you. What you need to do is go to the next level up, the state agency that operates in the region. All right, go to the state agency, or if it's municipal, go to the sheriff. If it's sheriff, go to the state. You know what I mean? You got to go one level up. You got to report it one level up, and do it in writing, not to a friend. There is no accountability there.
And that's something I wasn't aware of. And I don't think a lot of the women are aware of that either. Mine stayed internal the entire time. Yeah. And every time I proved, they were trying to disprove something and I proved it with evidence, they just kept bringing up more things to shut this just to close the case without charges or anything like that. Within this investigation, I found out that I was the 14th woman to complain about his actions, and he worked in the family court system. So he was targeting women in very vulnerable situations. All of the women that he targeted were going through divorces or custody battles or things like that. So he would approach them and act like he could protect them. And then he had 14 complaints altogether against him, which nothing stopped. He didn't lose his job. Nothing happened. So I would guarantee that he's still doing it to this day. There was no consequence.
That's what's called impunity. When you have no consequences, you can act however you want. So the next thing that has to happen is when you receive the complaint, you have to investigate it, all the elements and notions. And what you're supposed to do is take that modus operandi, identify the elements of the modus operandi, and then look and see if you have any unresolved or resolved cases with that similar modus operandi. The other thing is, if you have enough for a warrant or you're able to make an arrest in a particular case, you take the DNA of that person and you run it against the national database and the local state database. The two things I just mentioned are almost never done unless the person who is being complained against has been in contact with law enforcement before or is in law enforcement, and law enforcement has a personal grudge against them. Mm-hmm. This happens a lot with informants, with drug dealers, with other kinds of violent offenders, and with fellow police officers that officers do not like. They will target them for these kinds of allegations, and they will beat the drums to find other victims and see if there's other people, even under threat of arrest, instead of it being an organic investigative process. Because at the end of the day, this is the problem. Law enforcement don't know how to investigate rape cases. They don't know how to investigate domestic violence. They know how to respond, but they don't always do that properly. And they certainly don't know the protocols for a competent investigation of these things. So there's these things they're supposed to do in terms of identifying the modus operandi, identifying potentially other victims, and then collecting DNA and putting those into national databases to look for other cases. But the reality is they don't. The rape kits that are collected by the victim, those are supposed to go into the national DNA database. Almost none of them do. Why is that? It's because law enforcement does not want to actually pay for this investigation. They think, oh, it's $800 to test a rape kit. Unless we have a suspect, let's not spend the money because she might be lying or what have you. It doesn't matter. You put the DNA in the database. That's the best way to identify a pattern or serial rapist in your area is to have these. When there's a really great documentary, if no one's seen it yet, on HBO. It's called I Am Evidence. And in that documentary, it talks about how just in one place in Michigan, because of a big crime lab scandal they had, where a bunch of rape kits were sort of abandoned in the old crime lab, they just started putting them into the database. And they identified hundreds of serial rapists, hundreds in one city. And that is a very common story for larger cities. They don't have a couple or a dozen. They have hundreds of serial rapists in operation. And I think my perspective is that they are afraid that if they identify too many of these cases with DNA, it will unseat many of the cases that they've achieved through just witness statements, witness complaints that have been investigated poorly and where an innocent person has been identified and prosecuted and convicted. And so they're afraid of revealing the bad work they've done by doing this DNA investigation. And so that's why so many rape kits go unexamined, like 90% of them or something like that. Is that the same in Canada, or are you having a different experience?
No, I feel it's the same experience. And the other thing I was going to add on to that is in my particular case with the other 13 women, those rape kits would have never been put into the database because they were protecting a chief's son. So there was a whole nother level that his dad was the chief of police. He got away with this forever. They just kept sweeping him under the rug, and none of that evidence would be handled or put where it needs to be. We all know that.
No, and that's again, it's a reality that I think that the regular citizens who are not in the criminal justice system, they don't understand how broken, biased, and prejudicial it can be against a victim in these kinds of cases. But worse than that, when it involves an officer who's a suspect, not only will they rally around him to protect him, they will lie and fabricate and lose things and try to gaslight the victim into not making the report. They will absolutely, if you continue and proceed and persist, they will make threats. Threats will be made. They will make you feel unsafe with your complaint.
Yeah, they did. And then that was when I found out, because like I had said before, I was going through the recruitment process for the police at the time, and they threatened me multiple times. I had cops show up at my house. I had text messages come through, calls that if I was to go forward with it, I'd never get hired my entire life because I will be red flagged or blacklisted or whatever they wanted to call it. But they do. And that's exactly how it happened. And then when I was, like I said, I was proving what they were trying to disprove. They were trying to find any reason not to go forward with this. So when they decided to close the case, the reason that they gave me was that everything else looked like it was accurate, that I was telling them, but they were closing the case due to not enough witnesses present.
So there weren't enough people watching you being sexually assaulted?
That's right. There weren't enough people there watching.
Yes, he should have done it at the precinct house.
And I said to the detective at the time, I said, well, you know what, that's no problem. I understand where you're coming from. And next time I'll send out party invitations before my sexual assault, and then we won't have to go through this. There'll be enough witnesses.
Oh, my God.
He said some very unpleasant things, and then I asked him.
Yeah, there's no there's no foundation for that position. There can be zero witnesses. You have right. The statement of the victim is one thing, and then you have to investigate that statement. And if you find the statement to be credible, then you need to make an arrest. I mean, if your statement was credible, as he said, it doesn't require witnesses. It requires an arrest.
Exactly.
And
I was aware of that.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it requires an arrest. Law enforcement are really good about making up the law, making up the rules, making up things on the spot to make the victim feel like they are not protected, they're not going to be helped, and that they're actually a nuisance that might actually result in them being arrested for reporting the crime in the first place. It's very interesting that the culture of law enforcement in this regard. So
it is.
Lest people think that we are being too difficult, let's talk about what just happened I'm going to share my screen here. Share, we'll go to Chrome tab. We have this, Christopher Beltram. Here we go. Baltimore. What just happened in Baltimore? We have a police officer who was convicted of sexual assault. What does he say? A Baltimore County police officer, Anthony Westerman. We get a nice little picture of him right here. That's Anthony Westerman. Can everybody see that? It's going to be a police officer from the city of Baltimore. All right. Well, what happened? What happened is he was convicted of raping one woman in 2017 and assaulting another in 2019. And he was actually, everything was found to be true. Everything was convicted. Everything was, the witnesses were reliable. The evidence was solid. He absolutely did these things. And the judge sentenced him to 15 years, but suspended all but 4 of those years, saying, I'm sentencing you to 15 years on paper, but you don't have to serve any of them. I'm going to give you 4 years of probation. He gave him 4 years of probation. Why? Here was his reasoning. He believed that a sentence of probation was appropriate because the victims failed to show proof of psychological damage. They failed to show proof of psychological damage. This is a horrific ruling. Can you tell me why you think it's horrific? And then I'll tell you why I think it's really horrific. You tell me first. Why is this ruling so terrible in many, many ways? You tell me why.
So
maybe you think it's a good ruling. I don't know.
No, I do not. I do not agree that that is a good ruling. And proof of, do you know how difficult the court or law enforcement or whomever we're speaking of at this moment makes it to prove psychological damage?
Or makes it to prove any damage, to prove anything.
They make it next to impossible.
The word we're looking for, it's called either structural or, in specific, institutional violence. When they create a mechanism by which the person trying to get help from the state is blocked at every turn, whether it's too complex or the aid has been it exists on paper, but it's been defunded, or you just have people in these positions who are dangerously ignorant and hostile towards victims. That's called institutional or structural violence. So go on.
Just set it up.
I only said the word. I only said the big word.
But no, that's the first thing I think of, because they're trying to make you prove something that is next to impossible to prove. So if that becomes a ruling, and then you, as the person, try to go out to prove that, they will shut it down at every aspect. There's no way to prove that I've seen that has become accepted into the rule or into the process at all for any sort of mental or psychological or emotional damages.
Well, that's first thing you're supposed to do when you have an actual complaint of sexual assault is you were supposed to worry about health and welfare, which means you remove the complainant from that environment where they got the trauma, and you get them help. If you believe they just suffered a traumatic event, then your job is to get them help. Mental health intervention is required at this point. Instead, what they do is they move right into prosecution or defense mode, and they start interrogating the victim. And then they maybe do it just one time and never talk to them again. Instead of reaching out to see if they're okay, instead of actually getting them the help they need, getting them the financial resources of the state behind them so they can get compensation, so they can get, if they're a person who doesn't have money, who doesn't have a home, they can get something to eat, a place to stay, they can get the help they need to get them out of their vulnerable context. The state has the resources to do that, and law enforcement are supposed to be the ones delivering that, or putting them in touch at least with a victim's advocate who does that. And what we've seen in our cases, haven't we, that we're working together over and over again, is law enforcement is ignorant of these laws. They don't want to talk to the victim, and the victim's advocates are essentially not even present. It's horrific.
They don't do any of that here either. They don't offer those services. I'm sure, I just say in my experience in the cases that I've worked, there hasn't been an offering of those services to victims. I'm not saying it never happens. I'm saying that I rarely see it. Yep. And I also, on the flip side of that, I also see that the victim is always questioned, like, why haven't you gone to counselors? Why did you wait so long? It must not have been that traumatic because nobody heard you scream they're always questioning it and making them feel bad about the whole thing that happened to them.
So this is the problem with sexual assault, especially people in the justice system. They have this idea that they can detect rape, but they're human rape detectors. They're not. Someone tells you a story of sexual assault, you don't believe or disbelieve, you investigate, because that's your responsibility. You find out what's true and what's not through your investigation, not upfront with your biases and your prejudices. You don't let those guide anything, because they're always going to lead you in the wrong direction. So when you put a new barrier in place, this requirement that they act like a victim, it presumes that there's a normal way that victims act when they've been sexually assaulted. It presumes that there is a predictable, reliable, consistent trauma response that a judge is just going to be able to tell, or a police officer is just going to be able to know. This is the problem. The arrogance, the ego that takes is amazing, because the reality is there is no one way that a victim of a sexual assault or a rape responds. Everyone responds within their capabilities and within their own history and gifts and context and privilege. Some have very good responses with good support and good structure, and some do not. And the response is dictated by those things and many more. So there's a wide variety of possibility. So creating this non-existent, unattainable fantasy standard, which comes from movies and television only, that there is a telenovela type response that a victim will give that must be present, means that this ruling, in my view, will only serve to encourage false reporting.
I was just going to not in those words, but I was going to bring us down the path of.
Let's do it. You tell me. Give me your side. Give me your version of it, because I think
the other side of rape investigations or sexual assault investigations, I see very clearly are the amount of times that there is a false report of rape as well. So I find that in actually a few cases that we've worked together, there is a report that comes over, and it's to get away with something or to get out of a situation. So for example, a wife cheats on her husband and he finds out about it and she's like, well, I was raped. And then they push them to do the report because they're, pushing them because of what they told them, and they're trying to save their relationship or save face in the relationship.
Especially among the very religious, right?
Yes, and there are a lot of these that happen, and it's really frustrating when these cases come up for me, because there are victims that have suffered a sexual assault and they don't feel comfortable to go. One, probably because they don't believe that law enforcement's going to believe them. But we have a double-edged sword here, because we have people in law enforcement that are incapable of doing the investigations. They have no idea what they're doing. And then we also have law enforcement officers that have seen a lot of false reports, and they now don't know who's telling the truth, and they become so jaded.
Right.
So they just ask these questions that are completely inappropriate and then make the person who has suffered something shut down.
Let's set the stage for people about how a law enforcement interview with a complaining victim of sexual assault goes. It is possible, and in fact, even likely, that will be the situation. You can have a person who is making a complaint and they don't know how that's false, and they don't know how to they don't know how to present as a fake victim. So they go online or they use movies and television to get this idea of how they should behave in terms of crying, in terms of hysteria, in terms of what have you. They come up with these series of very exaggerated expressions of pain, suffering, trauma, and victimity to project into the interview, right? Now, that's their side. This is somebody who's faking it. They've learned the things that you need to do to fake it from movies and television. The person who is investigating the crime is not properly trained. They are not properly educated. They barely understand you try to get them to explain consent, and they won't be able to do it. They have no idea what they're doing in terms of the investigation. So they go and they do some research on what a victim looks like, and they get their idea from movies and television. So you got one person faking their investigation, one person faking their victimhood, and they're both faking it to each other. And when they're done, each one of them thinks they've done a great job. And that happens a lot. It's not the majority of the time, but it happens enough that it gets our attention. What this ruling will do, what this ruling has done, first of all, is said, if you're only going to get treated as a victim if you really act like you're suffering, right? If you really truly get hurt. If I don't think you've been hurt enough, I'm not going to protect you, and I'm certainly not going to punish the guy. All right, that's the first thing. And that kind of ruling is the only word is outrageous. It is a corruption of justice. It is a corruption of justice, and I would want to tear in to that judge's finances. I would open an investigation into him immediately for fraud and corruption. I feel like that kind of ruling only happens when a shoebox of money, either figuratively or literally, comes across the desk. That'd be my first thought. All right. And I'm not a conspiracy guy. I don't do conspiracies. I do evidence. But that's my first thought. Why would he put himself on the line like that? So that's how the police protect their own. They have judges backing them up, helping them out, right? In Baltimore. Baltimore's like super corrupt, so that's not a surprise. But let's talk about the other case, the Christopher Belter case. We'll share that one real quick here. We'll go to share screen. We'll go to the Chrome tab. Here we go. This is a 20-year-old frat boy who, while in college, loved to have parties at his parents' house. His parents are both super wealthy private attorneys. All right. And what he liked to do is he liked to have these young girls over, and he would sexually assault them when they were incapacitated, when they were drunk. And he did it not one, not two, not three, but 4 times. And he was convicted of it. He was convicted outright. And instead of, if this had been a black guy or a Haitian guy or Dominican or a Puerto Rican or a Mexican, I guarantee you that this would have been life in prison, no parole.
Yeah.
Without question, for a serial rapist. Okay. Do you disagree with that statement, or am I just acting like crazy?
I do not disagree.
All right. So, but this is a white kid of privilege with a wealthy family. So the judge said, amazingly, I went home and I prayed about this because I didn't know what I was going to do. Now, we need to back up and say this kid was charged as an adult, not because the judge wanted to, because the judge set his probation and parole. So we're going to do this period of time where you're where you're out on bond, and if you violate your bond, then I'm going to charge you as an adult, and we're going to proceed that way. So he let the kid out on bond while he was being prosecuted for 4 separate rapes in his own home of young girls he invited there and gotten drunk. And he violated those conditions of that parole of that bond repeatedly. So he had to bring him back in and then put the charges as an adult. So the judge's whole idea now is, now at sentencing, I got to think about whether this kid deserves it. Because what he said he was doing is he's weighing the future of the kid against the damage that was caused. He's thinking, well, the damage is already done. And the girls went to the house willingly. And so they kind of knew what they were in for, right? Mm-hmm. That's what girls who go to someone's house and get drunk, they're kind of just asking to be raped, right?
They expect it.
So he was just acting in his element. He was just acting because boys will be boys. So instead of giving him a life sentence, or he gave him essentially the same kind of deal as the cop got, no prison time, and home arrest, right? Mm-hmm. This is again outrageous.
Home arrest where he was doing the assault.
Where he gets to stay in the environment where he was.
Just keep inviting people to you. Yeah, we don't see a problem with it.
I don't see a problem with that. Exactly.
No.
But this is so tone deaf on not only what rape is and the damage that it causes and how different people respond differently, but it's also tone deaf to the gender perspective. It puts, again, the burden right on to women. Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm going to give you the bombshell thought that I've been having for some time now. And during the pandemic, it has crystallized into this unassailable theory that I have. And that is that things are getting worse in terms of in the United States, in terms of serial rape. We are becoming just like every other Latin America or African or Asian country that has this problem of machismo and men who believe they are entitled to rape. Instead of it being them selecting vulnerable populations, pretty much anyone who's white and has privilege and has money, they're feeling like they can attack any population that they want. This is a very devastating consequence of what I consider the Trump effect, which is that there is no justice, there is no law, and you can buy your way out of anything. You can say what you want, do what you want, treat women how you want, speak of them as however you want, rape one on Fifth Avenue in front of everyone, and nothing will happen to you. Mm-hmm. That is where we're at. We've seen it in Alaska. We've seen it in Baltimore. We've seen it in New York, where police officers have fought and won, in some extents, lost in some others, the right to sexually assault female victims in their custody. Basically, they would pull over young girls. This couple of detectives would pull over young girls, and they would force them into sexual relationships in exchange for favors when they were intoxicated. And that favor being, of course, that they would release them. Mm-hmm. This is organized cartel-style, systematic serial rape, and the police want to be able to keep doing it. And so their argument is, well, if they're in our custody, that doesn't mean we can't have sex with them. It doesn't mean they can't consent. Are you out of your mind? Someone who's physically in police custody in handcuffs? No, they are the definition of it being unable to consent, because the power asymmetry is so high. You have the gun, the badge, that you control the space, you control their legal future, you control their physical moment, and you're saying they can consent? Are you out of your mind? But that's the argument. To respond to that, because that to me, that's the problem.
It's their belief that anyone at any time can say no and can consent to something like that, because that's just the excuse they're using. You can't. No one in their right mind is going to consent willingly do that, but they feel they have to. It's the same sort of, I was going to touch on this before, going back to the way somebody might behave in the situation or react in a situation like that. Aside from a gun and a badge and in custody with that power dynamic, there's also fear that comes over, and there's a shutdown. Some women in those situations, women or men, they can completely shut down and not say anything.
Right.
And that is also used against. That is also like, well, they didn't say anything, so it must have been consent. It's pretty clear when someone is not engaging in the act and they're not enjoying themselves at all, that it's probably not consented, but enthusiastic consent.
Yeah, the enthusiastic consent. That's the thing. If it's not going to be pleasurable and enjoyable for everybody, you have a consent question as far as I'm concerned.
That's
if
right.
someone's consenting in a context where the power asymmetry is huge, we have to figure out why. Is it because they're trying to, is this an actual desire that they have? Or is the person submitting to the act actually trying to manipulate the person in power? Or is the person in power manipulating the person beneath them? Are they both doing this because they're planning on enjoying it? Is there
that's right. And there's so many different aspects to that, because there's also, as a female, I find that things have been normalized that shouldn't be normalized. Sexual assault, sexual touching, sexual content that people are saying to you, all these things have become just boys will be boys, because that's what we get. But in that moment, there's sometimes we feel that there's no choice. What if you're going to fight back? You might get hurt worse. We might not come out of this. We might die in this situation.
No.
What are the consequences? So a lot of the time you'll hear a victim come forward and say, I was too scared to do anything.
Yeah.
And then that's held against them as well. But okay, I don't know.
I think it's an issue, again, of gender perspective. I mean, you say it's simple to understand from your perspective. I got to tell you right now, I fight like tooth and nails to get men to understand this, because men don't want to understand it, because men benefit from the current system that exists, which keeps women in one place and male privilege in another place, especially if they're white males with even an additional level of authority and power. Men benefit from this tremendously. They do not want to acknowledge that it actually might be inducing sexual assault. There was a really great film that I watched starring our favorite actor jointly, Bane, the guy who plays Bane. What's his name?
Hardy?
Yeah, Thomas Hardy.
Yes.
Great actor, just a brilliant actor. And there's a movie, I believe it's called like Child 64 or something like that, where he's in Russia and he's trying to pursue a young lady, and he's a police officer. And they show you well into their marriage. It's like a few years, and like 5 or 6 years in their marriage, or even longer. I can't remember. But what sticks out in this movie, and I'm just going to give it away because it's just easier this way. He has this idea that he pursued her and she played cat and mouse. And then finally she gave into his desires and his romantic interests. And they finally started dating, and then they got married, and it was beautiful, right? From his point of view. When he tells that story to her, because they're having a crisis and there's this problem. And what she does really well in this movie is masking her horror, her fear of him. And she finally breaks down and tells him, look, do you remember when I first gave you that fake phone number when we were at the bar? It's because I was frightened of you. There's no way I wanted to date a police officer, because I thought you could disappear my whole family and I couldn't do anything about it. You could disappear me and I couldn't do it. I don't want to date a police officer. So when you started pursuing me and found me at my home and found me at my place of work, I felt like I had to say yes. And every single yes that you've gotten from me has been under duress. We do not have a relationship where I love you and respect you and where I need you. We have a relationship where I'm frightened that you're going to kill me. And that's why I married you. And he was just like, he didn't understand his own privilege, agency, and the asymmetry that existed. So, and he was actually thinking he was doing the right thing. He was actually not trying to be that bad. But there are guys out there who are, so that's one group of guys who don't understand that this system benefits them, and they're not, this Romeo that is so attractive. It's their power and agency that makes women frightened of them, or makes them react a certain way. But then there's the other group who are very aware of it and use that as a point of manipulation and coercion. So to me, the thing you say is the simplest thing, because you can understand it, because you're experiencing the fear, you're experiencing the potential consequences of the violence. Men are not. And so men are thinking, what's the problem? It won't be bad at all for me.
That's right.
I'm going to be
I'm not
fine.
going to get hurt.
Fine.
Yeah, I won't get hurt in this situation. I'm safe.
I'm totally safe. Why are you saying there's a problem? I'm going to be fine. Oh, you? Well, I suppose.
I don't
Maybe.
care about you.
Yeah. Well, that's the point. This is what it comes down to. This is what we call, again, necropolitics, deciding who matters. And in the situation of rape and consent, we always are forced to look at this through the male gaze and never through the female gaze. So getting men to understand how females see things and experience things would force them to acknowledge their own exploitation of that gender role, of that gender disparity, of that asymmetry in the power, socially, economically, and otherwise. This is why it's a fight. It's not a fight because they understand. It's not a fight because it's so complicated. No, it's a fight because they're benefiting from it. They're benefiting from the exploitation.
What I was going to add, when you mentioned about COVID and seeing that you thought that things, or you see that things are getting worse,
Yeah.
I was going to add to that because we've briefly talked about this before, but because of the lockdowns and the isolation and the use of online things like dating apps or Messenger or Instagram and all these different things, I found that it became much worse, and the ownership that men had over these situations, and they tried to push onto women. And there's a lot more of an excuse, I think, when you're meeting up with someone, say it's like a dating app, and you're meeting up with somebody. Well, there's this expectation that the guy is in it for a one night stand, and that's what they assume the female is in it for, without having a conversation. So the female could think, oh, I've met a really nice person, we're having good conversation, I'm going to go and meet them. And the guy's like, oh, it was on this dating app, it's just a one-time thing. And then they push and they push and they push. And the female, in some cases, they that's not what they were in it for, but yet now they feel obligated because we're getting told that, well, we spent all this time, you were talking to me, you were flirting with me, you owe me, I brought you out to dinner.
Right.
There's this rape culture, like you said, has gotten, it's just worse on all different aspects, on computer, in person, everything.
And we've just seen that it's infected completely now, the judiciary. Whatever reform, I mean, it used to be this way, and then we were making some progress, I want to believe, but now whatever progress we think we gained under the Trump administration, we lost. Because all of the wannabe incel rapists have come out of the closet. All of the men who believe that women are just there to be breeding stock or just there to be owned by men. And this comes directly from the religious community. All of those people are now flying their flags very high and very proud, as though sexual assault, sexual intimidation, and gender sort of, just any sort of exploitation of anyone because of their gender is totally okay. Totally fine. It is completely it started in the 90s. Let's just admit that. And Trump is the result of the 90s. He is as American as it gets. And his attitudes and beliefs and the words he used to describe women, to humiliate them and to make them into something that's an object for sexual desire, that is infected.
That's right.
Solely as an object of sexual desire, has infected the judiciary. It has infected law enforcement. And now they feel free to behave in that way. And we are now seeing rapists who are feeling free to behave. They're not being ashamed of this at all. They're not ashamed of what they've done. They think it's totally okay. But I will just say it this way. Any place where a population of vulnerable women gather, that place is going to have a cluster of serial rapists, different rapists who are there to target those vulnerable females. Whether it's a church group, a shopping mall, an Alcoholics Anonymous group, whether it's a homeless encampment or prostitutes working on the street, doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Homeless shelter, doesn't matter. These are the places where it's going to happen. Or when anytime you have this group of vulnerable people, there's going to be predators attracted to the jobs that are involved, having authority over those groups of people, or having or people with privilege can enter those areas and with money and with resources do what they want and leave and not fear reprisal, not fear like they're going to be investigated. That is not a failure of our system. That's our system working exactly the way it's supposed to, protecting people with wealth and privilege and maleness and whiteness, because that's who gets protected over and over again. And the judges, man, these naked, awful decisions to protect these convicted serial rapists, it blows the mind. You can do whatever legal maneuvering you want to suggest to try to minimize what happened, but no, you have multiple victims, all of them attacked by the same offender in both cases, and no jail time from a white male. That's, to me, that's where we're at. If we really are serious about the problem of serial rape, we will actually work on teaching officers how to make a good arrest, how to conduct a good investigation, and then how to make sure that they are identifying patterns that might exist as part of this case. If you've got one case, you've got the potential for a dozen more. And that's why law enforcement do not like investigating them. They don't want the responsibility. What I'd like to do now is open the floor up to any questions. I know my producer, Diana, is urging me to say, hey, ask people if they want to ask questions. Quit talking so much. That's what that message means. That's what the ding was. Did you hear the ding on your end? Because I heard it.
I heard it. I heard it very loud.
Whenever you hear that ding, that's Diana saying, Brent, let other people talk. So if you have any questions, now's the time. Anything you want to add to that, Melanie? My little editorial that I gave you.
I was going to say, if this was something that was a concern to law enforcement, I think we would see maybe some training at the beginning of careers. And I'm not just talking about police officers. I'm talking about anyone under the umbrella of law enforcement, or law enforcement at all. They should be taught. You are going to have this image. You're going to have this authority. If you're working in those places, say you're an officer and you're detaining people, or you're arresting people, and you're at the bars and there's drunk people, or you're a bouncer or a bylaw officer, whatever, and you're in those environments, it is unacceptable at all times to be with any of those people, because A, they're probably intoxicated, and B, you have authority over them. So even if they didn't want to, they're probably going to go along with it because of who you are and what you mean in that environment. But none of that is being taught to anybody at the beginning. It's just free for all. Like, just go and figure it out.
So the first two
Do whatever you want.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm 100% on board with all that. And I'll tell you why. The first two, we have two rules. Actually, I have a list of 10 investigative training points that I give when I do my sex crimes workshop, which lasts usually 3 to 5 days for different agencies. And the first thing, there's rule number 1, never ask the victim for a pen. Why? You can guess why, right?
Why?
Never ask the victim for a pen. Why?
You tell me.
Because you're showing the victim, the person who's making the complaint, that you are so unprepared, so unprofessional, and take their complaints with so little seriousness that you didn't even bother to bring a pen to write anything down.
I felt like it was going to be a deeper thing. I
wish. Man, I wish. Would be.
Yeah. Okay.
That's first thing. The second rule, I think you already know. What's the second rule? Don't ask the victim for a date.
No. Don't do that.
Well, patrol officers are famous for asking women out who are as a result of domestic violence calls. Victims in domestic violence calls and in sexual assault cases are notoriously victimized by law enforcement. With respect to, here's my personal number. I'm going to start texting you. I'm going to start doing this and doing that. And then all of a sudden they're sending dick pics. All of a sudden I'm a real man and I can save you. Let's meet for drinks. And here's a picture of my penis.
And
I wouldn't say that out loud, except for this. We have this. This is so well documented. It's such a well documented phenomenon. Cops have no problems, and they love to text from numbers or ID tags that are associated with their badge number, because they got a badge number fetish. They want everyone to know they're a cop. So when they text somebody, they identify themselves usually with their badge number in their texting, in their ID.
In my experience, I found that because most of them were married or had serious girlfriends, they never did it from their personal phone, so they used their work phone.
Of course.
Or all of those things.
The work phone. Or you can, or there's many other systems that they can use. But the point is, it has to start, I think you're right, it has to start with training. That would require law enforcement and those people working for the courts to acknowledge that they need training. The reality is they don't want training. They have a worldview about who the real victims are, who the real predators are, and who the real heroes are. And their job is to keep that narrative alive, to keep that narrative real, instead of to actually do the investigation. So that's the first thing, is training is absolutely true. But even at a more basic level, there has to be an understanding that women are not responsible for the predatory behavior of men. That's not how it works. Men, we need to raise better men, not teach women Krav Maga. In a perfect world, none of us would have to know Krav Maga. We don't need to know. Or
No,
Brazilian kickboxing or whatever shit it is you do when you kick the crap out of simulated men who, you're
exactly what it is.
You're much more physical than I am. I don't have that. I'm dangerously out of shape, and you're in such good shape. But it's because the world has taught you that you have to defend yourself, and we have failed.
Absolutely, and this isn't, in my personal experience, this is not one account. I've went through multiple attacks, not necessarily sexual assaults, but I've been attacked many times physically. So what did I do? It's exactly what I did. I went and I put all this money into all this training just so I could walk my dog at night. I should never have to worry about that.
They think, oh, woman in the gym. Oh my God, look at that. This is a woman working out and she's so sexy. And that's an invitation for me to start texting her things that are probably, pre-femicide, pre-rape behavior.
That's right. And another thing I would urge men to think about, which they won't because they don't hear it when it comes from a female whatsoever, but those women
in the gym, I'll tell them. You tell me.
Okay. Those women that are in the gym, there's a large majority of them that are there because they've been victimized, because they've been attacked. And they are trying to create an image on the outside of strength so that a man looks at them and thinks, oh, I don't know if I'd mess with her because she might put up too much of a fight. And we have to think about that. That is disgusting that we go in. Some of us have to go into the gym for that and that alone. It's not about health. It's not about wellness. It's about protecting ourselves by building this image. And when we're in there, what happens in the gym is you've got these predators that are like, oh, she's in here. She wants me to talk to her for sure. I'm just going to go over there and be inappropriate. So everywhere we go, we're trying to protect ourselves. And
I've worked 3 different serial rape cases, including studying the Cleophas Prince case out of San Diego, which involved men targeting women based on where they worked out. And they wouldn't attack them at the gym. They just they'd watch them at the gym and then they'd follow them home. Yep. And they'd have a list. Most serial rapists have a list of 3 or 4, maybe 5 women that they're surveilling at any given one moment in time. So when they decide the time is right for them, or they've got their plan completely in effect to where they want it, they can choose any female that night to do it. And if one doesn't work out, they can go to the next one on the list. Okay. Big place to choose is, of course, the gyms to follow them home, but also when they're out jogging. Women are extremely vulnerable when they're jogging because they want to get rid of the noise and the attention of men who are ogling them or who are making inappropriate comments while they're just trying to work out. They go increasingly at earlier times to experience fewer men, and then they put on their hoodies or they put on their earphones so they can't hear them. All right. And they just go into their zone. That's a problem because that makes them more vulnerable to men who are proficient predators, who are looking for women doing that in these areas early in the morning when there's nobody around. It just creates the whole way we deal with this problem of serial rape by not acknowledging it, by not investigating it, by not taking women seriously, by putting the burden on women. It forces, again, this is constrained context theory. It forces there to be a population of vulnerable women at a particular place at a particular moment that are easy targets for men who are looking to sexually assault women who have made that choice. I just see that. I see it as a natural. The serial rape is the natural product of this view of women. It's not about sex at all. It's not about sexual desire, because guess what? All of us grown-ups, we can control our sexual desire just fine. We have no problem. We can be in a context where there's a sexual context and not respond to it. It's just fine. We can do it without any problem. When men are not doing this because they're choosing not to do it, and they've normalized not doing it. They've normalized that behavior. And when it's normalized to a point of violence, when there's no consequences, that's impunity. And that's where you're going to see it spill out into the real world, into more violent and more expressive forms of violence with women who are either in intimate relationships with them, acquaintances, or strangers that they've targeted because they're in their environment. And I'll close with that. What thoughts do you want to close with? Because we covered a lot of ground this week.
I was just going to say, I was going to agree that everything has been so normalized, and there are people, we talked about men wanting to do the act of sexual assault, but there is such a large majority of men that don't even know that they are doing that. They get to the act of sex or whatever it is, but the way they're pursuing women is leading up to a sexual assault. And just because the woman has decided it's probably safer just to go along with it. They don't even have a clue that that's what they're doing. Or they're always going after intoxicated females and being like, oh, I got this girl and I got that girl. You don't even know what you're doing. These people, these women usually aren't even in the environment or the mindset to consent. So there are men that know that they're doing it, and there are men that have probably done it a lot of times and have no idea that that's what's happening. And
I will say it
everybody's
another way.
normalized it.
I totally agree with you, 100%. And what you're saying is there's a conversation that needs to happen. Mature adults,
right,
before they have sex, there'll be a conversation. If you've not had a conversation about consent or a conversation about what somebody likes or desires, if you've not had that conversation either verbally or non-verbally in some ways, you're open to those kinds of allegations. You're open, and you might be doing something. You might be coercing somebody who doesn't want to be there with you. And that is the hardest. Men are not capable of accepting that reality. Men respond badly to the idea that they are not attractive. They respond badly to the idea that they're not sexually proficient. So any rejection, any sort of barrier on their part to the sexual act that they desire, that's seen as failure. And that rejection causes a wound that they feel the need to respond to, instead of it being, oh, I'm a grown up and people can say no.
Right. And to add to what you said about the conversation, try having it sober.
Oh, man.
Give it a try.
Well, I always go back to the same thing. When you have a population of people who are not sexually literate and are not having healthy conversations about what sex and consent are, you are inviting tragedy. Men are not prepared to go off into the world of sexual negotiation because they've been told it's okay to be an aggressive. They've been told it's okay to be aggressive and to exploit. And women are being told, hey, men are aggressive and they're going to exploit you. Just expect that. So here's how you negotiate that world. And if you don't have these tools, well, don't go here at this time, at this place with these kinds of people.
Yeah.
But with men, we get no instruction. Do what you want. You're fine.
Whatever. You'll be fine.
So what I want to say ultimately is we know who the serial rapists are. We know where the populations of victims that are being preyed upon, and we have created institutional and structural violence against those victim groups to make it difficult for them to report and be believed. And that allows us to believe that we're not experiencing serial rape on the same level. That's a myth. And we're going to actually, I believe in the coming years, this is going to be a very big issue as we get DNA databases more streamlined. And then the decision to test and the decision to investigate is taken out of the hands of law enforcement and put into a more streamlined process where they don't have a choice but to actually do the work and get the training. That's going to be the thing that ultimately will make a difference, is when the decision is taken out of human hands and put into a procedure. And I hate that because I don't think that's a long-term solution. I think it's just a short-term solution to help us even grasp the dimensions of the problem. Those people who work in the criminal justice system and men in general do not like to acknowledge that this is a very, very big problem, because they believe they go after the jobs they do because they believe it will put them near an exploitable population that they can exploit sexually. That's not, it's by design.
No, if this is talked about and it comes to the surface, then they don't get to do what they want to do.
That's not just even to the surface. If they talk about it as though they talk about it from the female perspective, now they're a violent rapist who's exploiting women. But if they talk about it from the male perspective, oh, well, women are, they're out there doing this and they want it. I can assure you, they really don't. They really don't. They're the vast majority, unless you've had that conversation, you don't know what they want. So quit imposing that on people.
There's a lot of women who, right. There's a lot of women who want to wear what they want to wear and post what they want to post without having sex with you.
What? I thought all scantily clad women were doing that.
Want to have sex with every guy.
With every guy.
That's right. No, that's what it is. No.
So what you're saying is women's right to even express themselves is under attack under this paradigm. They're being told they have to act like a crazy person with trauma, like on television, in order to get justice, instead of just expressing themselves, instead of just being able to express themselves. Mm-hmm. That's very frustrating. So that's the end. That is the end of part 1. If you would like to listen to this later, we'll be available on Spotify and YouTube and every other place that podcasts are available. This has been The Hard Truth with Brent Turvey and Melanie Inglis. Thank you so much.